It is the 5th of December, 1757. Frederick the Great, king of the rising Prussian state, rides through the clear, icy winter air. Upon reaching a small hill near the village of Leuthen, he looks out on an overwhelming sight. As far as the eye can see, the enemy line stretches across the horizon. 60,000 Austrian soldiers, nearly twice the number he commands, stand ready to face his exhausted troops. But Frederick has already made his decision. Here, on the frozen fields of Silesia, he will meet the Austrians, and here he will determine the fate of Prussia. In his mind, only two outcomes exist: victory or death. What awaited Frederick was one of the bloodiest battles of the Age of Enlightenment. Although this era is often seen as rational, tolerant, and progressive, warfare was more brutal and deadly than ever before. Massive armies marched across Europe and were obliterated in spectacular clashes, like candles held in a blowtorch, to use an image coined by historian Dennis Showalter. This was the age of linear tactics, when soldiers formed long, thin lines to allow as many muskets as possible to fire simultaneously. At Leuthen, the Prussians set an enduring example of how these tactics were best executed. The battle is widely regarded as one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest, military achievements in Europe during the Ancien Régime. Even Napoleon praised it as, quote, a masterpiece of movements, maneuvers, and resolution. This is how modern historiography recounts the story of the Battle of Leuthen. The fertile fields of Silesia lay in the eastern part of the Holy Roman Empire, between Poland and Bohemia. The region was the most prosperous in Europe, with its rich agriculture, abundant coal and ore deposits, and central location for trade between Eastern and Central Europe. Silesia was a cornerstone of the Prussian economy. But that productive patch of land had not always belonged to Prussia. Frederick the Great had only seized the province from Austria in 1740, and Empress Maria Theresa was determined to reclaim it. When the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756, Frederick aimed to force the Empress into peace negotiations and secure her final renunciation of Silesia through a decisive victory on the battlefield. Though he faced an overwhelming coalition of France, Russia, Austria, and Saxony, he was determined to hold on to his territory and even expand his kingdom. The first year of the war was a disaster for the Prussians. Despite bitter fighting, most notably in the bloody battles of Lobositz, Prague, and Kolin, Frederick was unable to repel Austria and its allies. Instead, by the fall of 1757, a new threat emerged from the west. The Imperial Army and the French were marching against him. Frederick rode out to meet them and encountered the enemy near the village of Rosbach. In just 4 hours, in a battle considered one of the most one-sided of the 7 Years' War, he crushed an army nearly twice the size of his own. Yet, while Frederick triumphed in the west, everything was unraveling in Silesia. Frederick's deputy, August Wilhelm, the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel-Beveren, was hopelessly outmatched by the Austrians under Prince Charles Alexander of Lorraine and Count Leopold Joseph von Daun. The Austrian forces were strong enough to not only keep August Wilhelm in check, but also simultaneously overrun key fortresses. When Breslau, the capital of Silesia, surrendered on the 25th of November, more than half of the province had fallen back under Austrian control. By this point, Prussian morale was utterly shattered. The soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and hopeless. Many saw no reason to keep fighting and deserted. When August Wilhelm himself was captured during a reconnaissance ride, the last vestiges of the famous Prussian discipline collapsed. The emaciated troops looted and pillaged, while their officers largely looked the other way. Austria's advance in Silesia had pushed Prussia back to square one. When Frederick learned of this disaster, he immediately set out to return. General Hans-Joachim von Zieten rushed ahead to bring the marauding troops under control. On the 2nd of December, the king reunited the 13,000 veterans of Rossbach with the remaining Silesian forces, giving him a total of about 38,000 men. Though still outnumbered, and with troops who could barely march another mile, Frederick was determined to strike before the Austrians could consolidate their position in Silesia. Without the province, the Prussian army would be deprived of crucial resources. Frederick knew he had to risk a decisive battle despite the weakness of his army and the approaching winter. In the Prussian camp, some soldiers huddled around their campfire, trying to escape the bitter cold, when a stranger joined them. In the flickering light, they were astonished to recognize him as their king. Frederick sat down, ate with them, listened to their concerns, laughed at their stories, and promised promotions and rewards. Scenes like this repeated throughout the Prussian camp over the next few days. Frederick, known as a tough, even relentless commander, sought to instill confidence through personal contact with his soldiers. By speaking kindly, rather than punishing them for their previous behavior, he gave them hope and a renewed sense of purpose. This psychology strategy, which would later help earn him the affectionate nickname Old Fritz, was effective. The soldiers took heart, and morale improved dramatically. On the 3rd of December, Old Fritz gathered his generals at his headquarters near Pachwitz. Even there, his appearance was carefully staged. He presented himself as an old, weary man in a worn uniform, speaking softly as he delivered his famous Pachwitz address. The enemy is in a fortified position outside Breslau, which my troops have defended with honor. Tomorrow I will march to attack them. I am not in a position to account for my actions, nor for the reasons behind my decision. I am aware of the difficulties that stand in the way of this undertaking. But in my situation, there is only victory or death. If we are defeated, all is lost. The fate of Prussia would be decided in 2 days, on the 5th of December. Meanwhile, in the Austrian camp, Charles Alexander and Daun also concluded that a decisive battle was the best approach. They aimed to exploit Frederick's weakness, drive the Prussians out of Silesia once and for all, and bring the war to a definitive end. With a force far superior to the enemy, 66,000 men and 210 guns, they chose to leave their strong defensive position and go on the attack. Frederick's decision to take the offensive despite the supposedly depleted state of his army took his enemy by surprise. When their scouts reported that the Prussians were already nearby, the Austrians ordered their troops to march deep into the night and take up battle formation in an open field between the hamlets of Nippan and Sachschütz. By the time they arrived, darkness had fallen and there was no time for a proper meal. Hungry and exhausted, the soldiers collapsed in their hastily erected camps, a poor preparation for the battle to come. As the first light of the 5th of December broke across the cold winter landscape, the Prussians began their march. 2 long columns of infantry, flanked on both sides by cavalry, advanced in orderly formation toward Leuthen, while Frederick rode ahead with a vanguard. He first encountered the enemy near the village of Borna. A mixed force of Austrian hussars and Saxon cavalry blocked the advance guard, but a single, decisive assault scattered them in all directions. While his men dealt with the prisoners, Frederick rode ahead to survey the enemy's position from a small hill. The experienced tactician knew the terrain well. He had trained his troops on these fields in peacetime. Immediately, he spotted a weakness in the Austrian formation. Their left wing was exposed. A gap separated the outermost troops from a pond on the far left. Though the gap had been closed with field fortifications and reinforced by artillery, it was still a weak spot. In addition, a line of hills in front of this wing blocked the Austrians' line of sight. A plan began to take shape in the king's mind. When Frederick shared his plan with his generals, a murmur ran through the group. From the perspective of a classical tactician, what he proposed was sheer madness. He intended to march his troops along the Austrian front, break through the gap between the left wing and the pont, and then strike at the enemy from the flank. To keep Charles Alexander from immediately realizing his intentions, Frederick would have to divide his already outnumbered army. The plan was brilliant, but extraordinarily risky. Frederick opened the battle with a feint. He sent his mounted vanguard and several infantry units to advance against the enemy's right wing, creating the illusion of an attack there. Charles Alexander and Daun took the bait, shifting their reserves to the northern end of their line. Meanwhile, the rest of the Prussian army moved south, parallel to the enemy front, hidden behind the hills and shrouded in an eerie silence. This maneuver would have been unthinkable for anyone other than Frederick and his Prussians. A single alert scout could have spoiled the plan, and the risk of becoming entangled a few hundred meters in front of the enemy and turning into an easy target was enormous during such a complex maneuver. That the Prussians executed it so flawlessly in less than 2 hours is a remarkable testament to their training, their famous drill, and their discipline. Military historian Christopher Duffy describes the maneuver as, quote, a textbook example of the oblique order, end quote. A formation where one wing is held back to concentrate the army's striking power on a single point. Behind the Austrian line, Charles Alexander watched the Prussians carefully. In the distance, he noticed a faint movement, troops seemingly shifting southwest. He conferred with Daun, debating what it might mean and how they should respond. For the moment, they decided to hold their position. Unlike Frederick, Charles Alexander was unwilling to risk changing his formation in the face of the enemy, and he simply saw no need to do so. He is said to have remarked mockingly, quote, "Our friends are departing. Let them go in peace," end quote. The prince was so convinced of his army's superiority that he thoughtlessly dismissed the movements on the horizon. Frederick, he believed, had recognized his inferiority and was trying to avoid battle at the last minute. The attack in the north, he was sure, was merely a diversion to cover a Prussian retreat. Thanks to Charles Alexander's hesitation, the Prussians had all the time they needed to take up their positions undisturbed. Shortly after noon, the foremost units were ready to turn and assume battle formation. Frederick had chosen 3 infantry battalions for the initial advance, 2 from the infantry regiment number 26 and 1 from infantry regiment number 13. The choice of these regiments was deliberate. The 26th from Pomerania was made up largely of Wends, Slavs living in northern Germany. As a group with a common origin, these men shared a strong sense of community and loyalty. The 13th, a Berlin regiment known for its strict discipline, had earned the telling nickname Thunder and Lightning Regiment. The right flank of these men was protected by 3 grenadier battalions and 1 musketeer battalion, while a battery of so-called Brumas, heavy field guns, provided covering fire from nearby Glansberg. The rest of the infantry battalions formed a staggered line, each offset 50 paces to the west. Zieten secured the rear with 53 cavalry squadrons and half a dozen units of light infantry. Just before 1 p.m., the Prussians had completed their king's daring maneuver and were poised to charge the enemy from the flank. Frederick intended to strike quickly, unexpectedly, and decisively. When he ordered the assault troops to advance, he is said to have told the standard bearers, quote, "Boys, do you see the whitecoats over there? All you've got to do is go for them with the bayonet and run them out. I'll support you with the whole army. It's win or die." The Austrian left wing was commanded by General Franz Leopold von Nadasti. When the experienced Hungarian noticed the Prussian movement toward his position, he immediately sent a messenger to Charles Alexander requesting support. His commander, however, refused, even after Nadasti followed up several times, stressing the urgency of the situation. The general was left to face the attack alone. He could only oppose the Prussian assault with the mixed troops from the Holy Roman Empire stationed on his left wing, mainly Württembergers and Bavarians. Nadasti had deliberately placed them at the far end of his section because he considered them unreliable and hoped to keep them as far away from the action as possible. Now, they were in the very eye of the storm. Nadasti and his officers did everything they could to save the situation without the prince's support. They swung their wing 90 degrees to the left and took cover behind a shallow trench, securing at least a defensible position. Still, the outlook was grim. Frederick's spearhead was advancing straight for their weakest point. The men on the new front line met the Prussians with heavy volleys, holding their ground bravely for several minutes. But when the first ranks of Prussian soldiers emerged from the thick smoke of gunpowder like machines with fixed bayonets, the resistance collapsed almost instantly. The Württembergers on the front line panicked and fled, and the Bavarians behind them poured into the retreat. The Prussian army advanced rapidly, but without haste, under the cover of its mobile artillery. Soon they made contact with the Austrians, beginning with the 26th Infantry Regiment. These men were commanded by Prince Moritz von Anhalt-Dessau. When they were almost out of ammunition, the 60 rounds each soldier carried were quickly spent in such a fast-paced engagement. The prince ordered his regiment to fall back. Allegedly, the soldiers refused and sent an officer to fetch fresh cartridges. The men returned in record time, and the 26th pressed forward with full ammunition pouches. Whether or not this episode happened exactly as told, it illustrates some of Frederick's crucial innovations. In the previous battles of Prague and Kolin, his troops had suffered heavy losses while approaching the enemy lines. At Leuthen, he had them advance under constant fire, allowing them to weaken the Austrians before first contact, and forcing the enemy to remain under cover. Such a tactic had rarely been attempted before, as it required extraordinary discipline. Soldiers had to fire while maintaining a steady advance rather than seeking shelter to engage the enemy from a relative safety. To meet the increased need for ammunition, Frederick brought supply wagons that followed the advancing infantry alongside the artillery. This is what enabled the officer of the 26th to resupply his comrades so quickly. As the infantry began to roll up the Austrian formation from south to north, the artillery demonstrated its remarkable mobility. This was especially true of Frederick's horse artillery, which was known as flying artillery for its speed. The artillerymen constantly repositioned their guns, keeping pace with the infantry and providing continuous cover for the advancing troops. When Nadasti saw that his front line was beginning to give way, he attempted to salvage the situation by throwing his cavalry against the Prussian flank. The horsemen gathered and galloped around a small wood on the eastern edge of the battlefield. After a few minutes, they encountered Ziethen's cavalry, strategically positioned behind the right wing for this very scenario. The foothills and uneven terrain made a coordinated attack impossible, and chaos ensued. Only when Ziethen committed the last of his 53 squadrons did his men gain the upper hand. As the Austrians broke off their assault, the Prussians pursued them to their own lines and charged the infantry, which was retreating slowly. They quickly captured around 2,000 demoralized Austrians. This shattered the last resistance, forcing Nadasti to fall back along the whole line. Only when his left flank began to disintegrate did Charles Alexander realize what was really going on. He attempted to reinforce the weakened wing by sending several infantry regiments from the second line, but when this proved futile, he was forced to resort to more drastic measures. Finally, he had no choice but to order the entire formation to turn 90 degrees and form a new front facing south. Much to his regret, it quickly became clear that the Austrians were less adept at maneuvering under pressure than their opponents. Instead of moving in an orderly fashion, the battalions hurried in straight lines to their new positions, arriving exhausted. Lacking clear orders, they remained standing where they arrived, rather than forming proper lines. This made them easy targets for the Prussian artillery on the nearby hills. The guns on the Butterberg, in particular, inflicted heavy losses during these crucial minutes. By the time the maneuver was complete, the Austrians had inadvertently stretched the front line to nearly 10 kilometers, leaving their forces overextended. Now, finally, the two armies stood face to face. What they saw is exactly what you'll find in our new coloring book. Detailed illustrations of a Prussian grenadier, Frederick the Great, and a light infantry Jäger. We made it for people who want to do more with our artwork than just watch videos. Pick up a pen or pencil and bring these soldiers and commanders to life yourself. There's also artwork from other eras in there, including pieces from videos we haven't released yet. So it's a bit of a sneak peek too. The paper quality is solid, the illustrations are intricate, and it's genuinely great for studying uniforms, equipment, and the commanders who shaped these battles. It's a nice way to step away from a screen for a while. And if you've been following along, you might recognize a few of those Prussian soldiers already. At 3:30 p.m, the Prussians launched their attack on the new Austrian line. This marked the beginning of the second phase of the battle. Encouraged by the characteristic droning of their field guns, Frederick's infantry advanced inexorably. Their momentum carried them up to Leuthen in less than an hour, where their progress finally slowed. The village, though small and only lightly fortified, proved a formidable obstacle. The Austrians had entrenched themselves thoroughly and held a clear advantage behind the cover of the buildings. Frederick's men opened fire from a distance, while a small assault force moved forward to break through the barricaded gates. Once the entry was forced, the rest of the troops advanced and formed lines on the narrow streets of the village. What followed was an infantryman's nightmare. Muzzle flashes lit up every corner, roof and window. The soldiers fought their way through the streets step by step, storming one building after another, while the enemy lurked behind every wall and on every landing, ready to strike with bayonets or rifle butts. When they reached the church, the bloodshed reached its peak. An Austrian battalion had turned the building into a fortress, entrenching itself behind the cemetery wall. There, it held out against the Prussians until their artillery advanced and reduced the wall to a rubble. The Austrians lost ground, but both sides paid dearly for every step. As his men withdrew from Leuthen, Charles Alexander made one final attempt to turn the tide. He had the infantry form a new line behind the village and sent the cavalry against the Prussian left flank. This spot was vulnerable, since the infantry there had turned toward Leuthen. As 70 squadrons of cavalry galloped toward the Prussian line, the air shook with the thunder of hundreds of hoofs. For a moment, it seemed as if the horsemen would sweep into Frederick's exposed flank unchecked. Then, suddenly, the cavalry of the Prussian left wing appeared between the Schleierberg and the Butterberg, striking the Austrians from the side. The Bayreuth dragoons made contact first. Their impact forced the Austrians to slow down, and a fierce fight erupted. The dragoons had the element of surprise, but they were outnumbered and quickly came under heavy pressure as the Austrians regained their composure. At that moment, Friedrich Wilhelm von Driessen, commander of the Prussian left wing, committed his last cuirassiers to join the attack. Together, the 40 Prussian squadrons drove the Austrians north, right into the ranks of their own infantry. This was too much for Charles Alexander's already faltering troops. The cold hand of panic seized their hearts. One battalion after another grew anxious, laid down their arms and fled. The few units that remained steadfast were overrun by Frederick's advancing infantry, while those in retreat were cut down by the cavalry. As evening approached, heavy snowfall began. A white blanket slowly covered the scene of battle, hiding the bloody fields of Leuthen. Then, breaking the oppressive silence, one of the men began to sing, "Now thank we all our God." According to legend, the soldiers joined in, one after another, until the hymn, forever remembered as the Choral of Leuthen, resounded across the battlefield from thousands of throats. In a single day, Frederick the Great had regained everything his enemies had taken from him over the course of a year. Charles Alexander could hardly believe it. He withdrew from Silesia with the remainder of his troops. On the 20th of December, the garrison of Breslau surrendered following him. Leuthen was one of the bloodiest battles of the 18th century. Within just hours, more than 4,000 men perished and 12,000 were wounded. Yet above all, it was a masterpiece. The Prussian army had flawlessly executed its king's daring plan, demonstrating exceptional discipline and skill. The battle became a textbook example of linear tactics and the oblique order. Decisive action, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the extraordinary mobility of the artillery combined to produce one of the century's most impressive victories. Although the Battle of Leuthen did not compel Maria Theresa to back down and thus failed to achieve Frederick's immediate diplomatic goal, it had a profound impact on the political order of Europe, and indeed the whole world. On the frozen fields of Leuthen, Prussia demonstrated that it could stand toe-to-toe with the continent's leading nations, laying the foundation for its rise to a great power. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like or check out our coloring book. All of it helps support the channel in the long run. Thank you.